All I can say is it's an excellent sign when we need more chairs for the first talk. So it sets the tone for the year. So it looks like it's going to be a good year in terms of audiences for our speakers. I think we might as well get started now. We're more or less at 5:15, which is our normal start time. And I'm really delighted to introduce the first speaker of the Centre of Islamic Studies series for this academic year, Dr. Firas Al-Kabani, Associate Professor of Comparative Literature at the University of Sussex, where he also co-directs the Middle East and North Africa Centre, in fact, just been talking about, which is generally known as MINAS. So just to give you a little bit of background on our speaker, as you may have gathered by the talk title, he's an expert on 19th century Orientalist literature, travel writing, and the Nahda. In recent times, he's featured in multiple award-winning TV documentaries and films in the UK, and he's recently published his monograph, Richard Burton, T.E. Lawrence, and the Culture of Homoerotic Desire, with Bloomsbury just last October 2024. Is that last October?
It was actually the 17th of October.
No, so a year ago, basically, which has received, it had time to receive critical acclaim and endorsements. A flyer has been circulated, and you can see some of those endorsements up there on the screen before we really get stuck in to the meat of our talk. Firas obtained his BA in English Literature and Language at Damascus University and went on to pursue his postgraduate studies at the University of Sussex. He has an MA in English Critical Theory and a PhD in English Comparative Literature. And among other services, he performs for academia. He's a trustee of the British Society of Middle Eastern Studies and a member of the editorial board of Mashreq and Mahjar, Journal of Middle East and North African Migration Studies. He's also a founding member, as well as a trustee and co-president of the Syrian Academics and Researchers Network in the UK. So he's been part of many different initiatives, as well as his research. And we're really delighted that he's come to talk to us today. The title of his talk is not quite the title of his book, but even more intriguing, Sir Richard Burton and T.E. Lawrence, The Snake Charmers of Empire. So let's hope we're all charmed.
Thank you very much for the generous introduction. It's such a pleasure to be here actually today. I just want to start by saying that a lot has already been said and written about Orientalism. Indeed, a lot has said and written about Sir Richard Burton and T.E. Lawrence and many other Orientalists. Saying what makes my approach a little bit I think it's to do with my positionality. You just alluded to my background. I come from a Damascene family, but I grew up and was educated in different parts of the Arab world, as well as in the UK. I think that gives one a particular certain sense of a certain sense of point of view of like a perspective. I can see, and in my book, indeed, I try to kind of look at the nuance of things. I can see things from an Orientalist, a British imperialist, but even post-colonialist point of view. But I also, what I do is I look at other people. I'm interested in the nuance of things. So because I'm able to read Arabic is my first language, as well as English, I not only do I look at what those Orientalists have written, but I look at what has been written about them, how they were perceived by Arab scholars and writers from the period the same time. And I think this makes it a very closely knit kind of comparative study of states, multilingual kind of readings of primary sources. And I mean, let's face it, Orientalism itself has become a dirty word. We can't talk about Orientalism now without slipping into imperialism, colonialism, exploitation, and the rest of it. And yes, it is all of these things, but I think there's more to it. In fact, I think a lot of political science itself, the secular Orientalism, sometimes is misunderstood and misinterpreted. What I'm trying to do in this book is I'm trying to look at nuance. I'm trying to get rid of dogma, more away from dogma. Look into nuance itself, and look at what these writers were writing, how they were perceived, who they were writing, and how they were received in those places. Hence, my choice to zoom in on phrase I use in my book, where I call them both so it's Burton and Lawrence, the snake charmers of empire. Now, they are snake charmers in lots of ways because, like a snake charmer, they indulge in an act of distorting reality. They can all the legitimize crowd. That's what a snake charmer does. A snake charmer means to the audience, we think of them as playing music for a snake to dance to. That's not what's happening. And in a way, that's what they were doing. It is a bit of an act, it's a bit of a performance. So much of an act that they even created their own Oriental and Oriental kind of instruments with different names and the rest of I'll get into that. But that brings me also to the tableau of Jérôme, made famous, the snake charm or the Charme des Enfants, which of course was made infamous when it appeared on the first edition of Edward Said's Orientalism in 1928. Now, why are they snake charms again? Like that tableau, what they were trying to do really is to present a vision, a male sort of replica. I call it as like a male harem. It's more of a like a reverie of a male harem, whereby you get a stash of the East, of especially the Muslim Arabic speaking or the Muslim Oriental East, where you've got different kind of it becomes this amazing space that doesn't exist, much like that image there or that picture there. So within the literary kind of discourses, I argue what they're doing is what Jérôme's done. I mean, of course, this image was not meant for the people of the region. It was meant for the European viewer, coming for Europe. And in it, actually, we see like a mishmash, which is such a mishmash of Oriental, Muslim men and boys coming from different parts of the Muslim world. They are from different eras. I mean, the space itself actually doesn't exist. I mean, some of it is based on the Golden Passage of Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. So some of it is based, I mean, the floors, for example, come from the mosque of Ibn Amr al-Qas in Cairo. So it's not a place that exists, but it's a fantasy. What I'm arguing in my book is that what Burton and Lawrence were doing was a version of that, but they did it in terms of their travel writing, their service for empire, but also they did it for themselves. And Lawrence in particular thought he was doing it also for the Arabs. So this is the nuance that I tried to look at in my book. Let me talk briefly about, so this is the scope of my study. Of course, it is Orientalism and sexuality. I'll get more to that in a minute, but I think in relation to the period, it's the long 19th century. Now, this is a very significant period in the region, because this is the period where we witnessed the gradual collapse of the Ottoman Empire, which was being replaced by modern European powers, imperial powers coming into the region. But it also witnessed something slightly unprecedented in modern times, whereby we had lots of Arab writers and scholars who were sponsored by our governments, especially in Egypt, who went to Europe, and their task was to study European scholarship and to bring it back and to translate it. In fact, this is the period that also witnessed, the modern kind of canonization or the modern kind of formation of the Arabic literary canon with the long 19th century. Part of that was in relation to what they found in Europe in relation to what Europeans have written about them. So that's an important. And that impacted the way that Arabic literature had kind of configured its own perception of sexuality or what was allowed as okay or not okay. So, for example, we've got things like the genres of adab al-mujun and adab al-marafa, ghazal al-mudhakkar. Al-mudhakkar is a name of poetry. Mujun translates roughly as bawdiness. These existed in pre-modern Arabic literature. This was the period when they kind of were slightly being kind of censored out. But at the same time, and this is the paradox, we get more and more Orientalists going east, now going on the flying carpet of empire because they are in service of the empire. They are doing things for empire. They are living in those places, producing knowledge, etc. But they're also doing it for themselves. But what they were doing, and this is something I argue in the book, that each Orientalist created their own vision of the Orient. What one Orientalist is saying, each Orientalist had their own Orient. But the one thing that this Orient had, that it was exotic and just other, was that it was and sexuality were on the. So this is from Sir Richard Burton's theory on sexuality, the Israelitic zone, which I'll come back to in a minute. And this is the theory basically where he argued that people in hotter climates are more prone to be homosexual. But I'll come to it in a minute. But what I'm talking about is this kind of paradox between the two. And if we move further from Burton to Lawrence, of course, he was known for his role in the Arab Revolt and for other things, then what we have is a prototype of the blonde Bedouin, or the shape, or the English shape, basically, which was taken on by other kind of writers in the 20th century and in the 21st century, where we've got this image of the East, where, okay, well, it's other, it's sexual, it's oppressed at the same time. There's a bit of a purpose. And if we think of what the stereotypical image of Islam now, it's more like that. In the 19th century, it is more like that. But what I'm trying to do is to look at what happened basically. When I give introductory lectures on Orientalism, I think nothing explains Orientalism better than Orientalist art. These are, I mean, the French were very good at it in particular. So these are two paintings, and this is by André Denous for the Beauty of 1921. I mean, what it shows is the erotic and the exotic. The East was other. It was it's a place of luxury, but it's a place of semi-naked women. And if you're in doubt where this could be, just behind the brain, you can see a mosque. So this is a reminder of the connection between the Muslim East and other kind of sexuality, more kind of liberty of sexuality. Now, this is a very different concept of what we have now in the West, of what the East is associated with. And this is another one also by Jérôme. So it's the Grand Bath at Basra. Now, of course, you will never ever have access to places like that. It's the fantasy. But also, who is the audience? It's not portraying those images for Arab and Muslims to watch or to perceive them. It was the European viewer but this is when many people got their images of peace. It became this fantasy of otherness, particularly sexual otherness, sexuality as a marker of difference. Of course, this wasn't just in relation to art. I mean, literature as well. It's full of kind of Orientalist stuff. And I think one particular translator that we need to mention is Antoine Galland, who was the first European to translate Alf Layla Layla, or the Arabian Nights. And from his translation into the sort of the magic of the dancing boys and girls, things that were otherworldly, so much so that they inspired the Romantic movement in European literature as well. In one fantastical text is by William Beckford, who never really been anywhere south of Paris, that he wrote this text called Varte, in which, but in fact, I mean, he presented it, so he wrote it in French, because French was more suitable to huge stuff at the time. Then he presented it as a translation of a lost manuscript of the Arabian Nights. So it was presented really as the Southern and Second Night. Now, in it, he explored themes of sodomy, of incest, of extreme sexuality, of all sorts of things that you wouldn't talk about in refined European kind of company. Fast forward to 1828, we've got The Lost Flauteur, which was anonymously published in London. The text, again, explores sort of narratives of kidnap, of rape, and of sodomy. So sodomy in particular becomes very much associated with the Muslim East. So within that story, we've got a character, Emily Barlow, I think her name is, and she gets kind of kidnapped and taken to the harem of the Dey of Algiers, but then her sexuality is aroused and is awakened, and she writes to her friend Sylvia, and Sylvia arranges to be kidnapped as well to explore that other kind of sexuality. So it is quite insane, really. But let's now go back to the Arab world of the time. So what was happening? So when all of this stuff was being written about the Muslim East, especially with the Arabs, what was happening there? I mean, one important event was Napoleon's invasion of Egypt between 1798 and 1800. It was short, only 3 years ago, really. But it was quite significant because it was the first European Christian invasion of Central Muslim lands since the Crusades. That also shows something, that the Ottoman Empire is not as strong as it used to be. But it also put the Arabs face to face with the Europeans on their land for the first time in modern time. But here, these were like a force. These were like the power that came in. Now, one of the things that Napoleon brought with him wasn't just an army. He actually brought an army of scholars, and he established Mujana al-Masri, or the Institute of Egypt, in which there were lots of modern scholarly and scientific kind of tools on display for Arab scholars to see, and also this is a place where Arab scholars and French European scholars had time to talk to each other and discuss ideas. And through that, there was a bit of, I mean, this really just opened very much a new interest on the part of the Arabs in all things kind of European. I mean, but not unlike the European kind of counterparts, they weren't just interested in kind of scholarship, literature, philosophy, etc. They were also interested in kind of manners and local kind of mannerisms and sexuality and gender relations. One of the people who kind of recorded Napoleon's campaign in Egypt was Abdurrahman al-Jabarati, or the chronicler, and while he admired what he called the French kind of dedication to knowledge and literature and philosophy and science, he had less than flattering views about what he referred to as the French kind of sexuality, gender relations, and general kind of hygiene. So this is a quote writing. I mean, this was much longer quoted right from the summer. So he goes, "A French women do not cover themselves and have no modesty. They do not care whether they can cover their private parts. French men have intercourse with any woman who pleases them, and vice versa. Sometimes one of their women goes to a barber's shop and invites him to shave a pubic hair. If he wishes, he can take the income." So that's less known, actually. We sort of seen lots of kind of Orientalist stuff writing about Muslim women and all that. But this is less known. So they were also interested, and I think it's just human nature. People are interested in the other, especially, and I think that sexuality and gender relations become such a strong kind of marker of difference. Now, obviously, a lot of this is nonsense, just to say, but it is fascinating, and it's also funny, it is also funny to now. But what this move, what these 3 years kind of triggered was a long movement in Arab literary and cultural discourse called the Nahda. Nahda translates roughly the Renaissance or the Revival. And in it, we've got Muhammad Ali, who drove Napoleon out of Egypt. He decided to sponsor Arab scholars in Egypt to go to Europe and to study European scholarship, also translated in of that. He was interested in building a modern kind of nation state in European lines. He was really interested in like military books and that kind of stuff. But lots of these scholars also were interested in all sorts of observations. So they started translating all sorts of books, including books of literature, books of philosophy, also books that depicted Arabs and Muslims. So in a way, they started seeing themselves through the mirror of Orientalist literature. And they didn't quite like what they saw. The image was quite kind of ultraized from others. But one of the things that also quickly became apparent was that how European literature in general, compared to Arabic literature, was less kind of liberal when it comes to kind of things like depictions of like desire, sexuality, homoerotic desire as well. I did mention earlier kind of some of the pre-modern Arabic literatures, genres and such, like Adab al-Nujum, Adab al-Barafa. Nujum is bawdiness, Barafa is wittiness, and homoerotic poetry, al-mudhakkar, homoerotic poetry as well. These genres existed in Arabic literature up till the 19th and early 20th century. Obviously, they started being eroded and censored in the 19th century in the wake of this cultural encounter with a translation of it. But what they also realized was that European literature had a very different set of norms when it comes to kind of describing and depicting kind of sexuality and desire. This is from Rifat Tahtawi, who is one of the famous Arab Nahda kind of pioneer, or Ruwat al-Nahda, as we call them in Arabic. And this is from his book, Peace and the Brings Feet and Peace Berries. It's a book he wrote about Paris, but in it he observed lots of cultural things. So this is his discourse on love. So he's referring here to the French and Europeans in general, who were called the Franks in general. One of the better things among their traits is their lack of predilection for the lover in the nuance. This is one thing that is never mentioned among them, and which their natures and morality reject. It is not allowed in the French language for a man to say, I have fallen from the middle of the line, as they see this corruption of morals, and they are right. Now notice they are right. So there's already this change happening slowly. Obviously, it doesn't happen overnight. In fact, the last poem I think of al-mudhakkar was written in Arabic in the 1920s. But this is happening there. And the fuller version of this quote, he kind of talks about how when Orientalist writers translate Arabic literature, including things that include, sort of homoerotic desire, they would translate that, they would change the gender of the boy or the juvenile to girl because that's the and of course then he links it to his scientific mission, which is to go and learn about electricity and science and all the lovely European stuff. But this is right at the end. This is really quite beneficial. Now, so while Arabic literature was gradually changing, and you wouldn't really know this at all if you just read the contemporaneous kind of Orientalist stuff that was happening there. Like I said earlier, this is a very, very critical period, cultural encounter and knowledge between the Arab Middle East and Europe. So the Ottoman Empire was, it was the beginning of the end for it. It was losing kind of territory in lots of places and were being replaced rapidly by the great European powers who were there. And this time also witnessed that those Orientalists, even though there had always been lots of Orientalist travelers going east, they were not just going now to have fun. Well, they were going to have fun, but they had also means. They were sponsored by their empires to go there and catalog and study and narrate that things. But that wasn't just their own mission. I think they went there because, generally speaking, if we look at them now, I think it'd be fair to call them social misfits. They were not your average person. They were very, very, very much kind of not feeling at home back in England or France. And they all came from certain classes that are so this is here. I mean, one of the ironies that while things were changing in the Arab world, becoming more kind of European-like when it comes to kind of celebrations of desire and writing about that, the discourses of a lot of these Orientalists are here. We've got Edward Lane, for example, one of the translators of the Arabian Nights who went into Egypt. Of course, he also dressed up. We've got T.E. Lawrence, I'm going to talk about it in a second. But Jane Digby, who was an English upper class lady who didn't really like life in Europe. She embarked on a scandalous series of affairs, ended up in Damascus, also dressed up as a Muslim, Isabel Bahart, who was Swiss Russian, went to Algeria and North Africa, dressed up as a man, and married somebody who was a man, but they both referred to each other as like brothers. And then we've got Flaubert there, of course, and then we've got Sir Richard Burton, who we're going to talk about also in fact, I'm going to talk about the Burton now, because he's one of the subjects of the work. Now, how do I kind of define Burton? I think it would be fair to say that he's the ultimate kind of representation of the figure of the Victorian polymath. He was a linguist, he was a translator, he was a poet, a writer, a soldier, a spy, a diplomat. What else? He was a swordsman, he was an explorer. I mean, there really wasn't anything that he didn't do. And he excelled quite a bit at it as well. He was interested. I mean, I think in the West now, I mean, he was known also for his translations of Oriental like sexuality and erotic literature in general. I mean, Samakutra, the Kama Sutra, for example, was translated by. So he specialized in translations of Oriental erotica, but he also took on a persona. He wasn't just going to be just all boring kind of person. He spoke 40 languages. I mean, his two native languages were English and French. He grew up in France, and then he became such a talented linguist and discovered that. But a lot of his teaching was self-taught. He would go to places and just talk to people and just teach himself. He was just talented at it. But then he invented this persona that he wasn't just going to be Richard Burton, he wanted to be like an Oriental, and he had to have a name, he had to have an original message. So he called himself out for himself Abdullah bin Bashir. He was meant to be of Persian and of Arab descent. In 1852, 1853, he embarked on a trip to Hajj, and it was very dangerous to go to Hajj there if you're not Muslim. But he took that kind of masquerade, that Oriental masquerade, skin deep. I mean, he would dye his skin with henna to look darker, so it's from those parts of the world. He would also, then eventually when he went on Hajj to Mecca, he even had himself circumcised as well. So, I mean, one wonders why would he want to, but, but just in case, so he wanted to be, he wanted to have like a full disguise. I mean, he was a fascinating figure in all sorts of sort of ways. I mean, of course, completely bonkers as well, but then that goes with the territory. I think that's what I meant by them being the social mistress. I think when it comes to his literary fame, I think, and this is the reason why he got his knighthood, was that he translated. So I did mention earlier that the first translation of the Arabian Nights, Al-Qur'an, was conducted by Antoine Galland in 1704 to 1711. Since then, lots of other have been translators or took the tales on translating. But then the vast majority, or all of them, really practiced a sense of censorship, self-censorship. Because lots of these tales, we need to remember that Arabian Nights actually date back to the 8th century. They were never ever seen as high literature in sort of Arabic literature at all. They were never seen as sort of, they did not attain the status of adab. Adab is a status of high literature, and the Arabian Nights were not seen that. In fact, people in the region became interested in them in terms of like studying them as like a serious literature because of Orientalists, which is so that's also very, very interesting. Unlike all the other translations before him, where translators practice self-censorship in the sense that they either not translate very kind of bawdy and naughty tales, or they would tone the security down. His translation, published in 1885, 1886, actually included every single tale. Not only that, but he exaggerated the sexuality. Like really exaggerated it. So if you look at the original Arabic, for example, compare it with other versions of English or French, his book was going somewhere else. But he used it also as a way to fight what he called Mrs. kind of Grundy, which is this figure of Victorian immorality. He was pro-sex and pro-sexuality. He hated the Victorian idea of all the kind of type and all of that. But the crazy thing he did was that, so this was a 10-volume translation, the longest ever. He used it in a way, almost as a very long fiction of the prologue, to come up with a theory of sexuality called the Insulartic Zone, which was published in a terminal essay attached to the 10th volume, about 300 words. And in the Insulartic Zone, he came up with this kind of pseudo-scientific idea. Of course, one of the things he was like he established like the Royal Anthropological Society in London. So he was an anthropologist as well. So one of the things that he came up with was the Oriental zone, where he referred to it as a climatically and determined geographical region, whereby if you happen to be there, then the masculine and the feminine hormones in one's body would mix up. If you look at it from today's perspective, this is utter nonsense. But at the same time, this was quite something, because back then, especially at that time, there was a de facto association between sodomy, i.e. homosexuality, or the word that was used, in fact, was pederasty, which meant homosexuality as we know it today. It wasn't just older men to younger men or boys, it just meant homosexuality in general. The idea of pederasty at the time was very much connected to kind of racial ideology. So Arabs in particular were seen as born pederasts, whereas what he was saying, as racist still as it is, was no, this is different actually, because if you go to a hotter climate, which included much of southern Europe, by the way, then you become more inclined to do that. Now he goes on a survey just around the world to count and recount lots of incidents of homosexuality, until he goes back to Europe. He goes to London, Paris, Berlin, and other northern European countries where he says the situation is the same here, really. So in a way, he sort of undoes his own theory uses the Orient as a place where people would readily accept that this is associated with other forms of sexuality, only to go back and undo his own theory. Very, very interesting. But let's then, and this is also one of the things that he argues. But while so doing at the same time, this is the other kind of nuanced reading. It's okay. Well, this is somebody who's used the most fictional of all fictional texts, probably the most fictional text of all time, to use it as almost like a prologue or like a case study to come up with a theory of sexuality. Those texts go back to the 8th century, and this is late 19th century. So it's completely wrong. But then he kind of defends his own decision to come up with this very big translation as follows. So he said that a student of Arabic who reads the Nas with this version will not only be competent to join any conversation, pursue the popular books and newspapers, and to write letters to his friends, he will also find in those repertoire of those Arabian manners and customs the use of practices which are not discussed in popular works. This is basically he's kind of displacing the fictional nature or genre of the Arabian Nights, turning it into anthropology, a piece of kind of theory. And bearing in mind, the text goes back to the 8th century, the 19th century, but there's the concept of the unchanging East as well, right? So this is very much part of it. But let's look at what was happening with the Arabian Nights in the original Arabic and other kind of Oriental languages. There was a bit of a, how to describe it, a bit of a like eureka moment. I remember I was doing my PhD and I found this. Let me first introduce Khalil Sarkis. So Khalil Sarkis was a Lebanese, not a scholar. I would say he was very much the epitome of the Levantine, in that sense. He was Christian, he had means, he was very well traveled. He went to Europe, to America, and wrote about his experiences. But one of the things which he wanted to do, which was very much in line with another thinking as well, was in order for the Arab nation to rise, it has to go back and rediscover its cultural heritage, reproduce it for the young generation to read. Very typical kind of nationalist stuff. And then maybe we can learn something in the past. But the past became a bit problematic because remember there was a level of al-mudhakkar, there was usual stuff which was being kind of frowned upon because they didn't like it, this is what they thought of us. So what he did, he published lots of works, including some European works in Arabic translations, and made the prices really cheap and affordably worthwhile. He also went back into the pre-modern Arabic literary kind of canon and published quite a lot. Because of the interest of the Arabian Nights in Europe, Arabian Nights also became of interest in Persia and in Arab world. It became problematic. So what he did with it, he came up with this version with only 3 volumes, and he cut out all the naughty tales. So this is the first expurgated version of the Arabian Nights that was ever published in Arabic. He actually published it between 1881 and 1883. Now, why did I talk about this eureka moment? Is because when I I pretty much read the 10 volumes, which are completely insane. But the forward and the terminal essay were really, and all the magic is happening there, and all the subtext in the footnotes throughout the whole place. Richard Burton says himself as a rawi. Rawi is like a narrator. And he says himself as an English and Arab rawi, somebody who's finished telling his Arab friends about the Nas, because he used to sit and read books to the Arab friends. Now he's going to the English friends and telling them and reading stuff like to them. And he goes, into the sort of sources he found. But then he mentions Sarkis. He says, this is what's happening with the Arab world. He actually refers to it as a problem. And the Arab world now is not what it used to be. And it's being kind of corrupted by people like Sarkis who are not Arab. And what he's produced is like a castratum. He refers to his version of the He says, my version is as the Arab had intended to write it in English. So he says himself as more Arab than himself, and he says that his version is more original. In a way, is in the sense that he included all the tales, but not for the reasons why he did that. But I think the book here itself works as a metaphor. While sexuality, especially other types of sexuality, were being kind of discussed and at length in European literatures and European kind of Orientalists reaching its zenith, translated very, very nice in Richard Burton's edition. The book was getting shorter and shrinking in the original Arabic. Now, before we move to the early 20th century, again, I mean, this trend has continued. And I think as late as 2010, there was an edition that was published in Cairo, which also posed a lot of issues, it includes some of the details as well. But this, I think the book itself works as a metaphor here. Now, when it comes to T.E. Lawrence, I mean, I deliberately chose these two kind of pictures, just to try and juxtapose him. I mean, this is Lawrence the man, and this is Lawrence the superhero. Because as a man, he was quite actually shy and mousy and didn't really want to talk much. But he put on his superhero attire, his alter ego, and became King Lawrence of Arabia, and became this otherworldly figure. I mean, he's best known for his role in the Arab Revolt, of course. I mean, he managed to create this impossible kind of alliance. I refer to it as a marriage. I refer to it as a marriage of convenience between the British, the Arabs, and the French. But he kept it only, and of course, he also had his own agenda. I mean, I think he genuinely wanted to kind of liberate the region and create one Arab kingdom and the rest of it, because that was very much tied in with his fantasy, which is a neo-Arthurian fantasy imbued with a touch of the homoerotic. While fighting in the Arab world, in Arabia, the only book he had with him was the King Arthur book, the one by Thomas Morley. Morte d'Arthur it was called, and he very much, I mean, lots of the things that he based his conduct in was very much linked to those kind of ideas of chivalry, of noble knights fighting for a good reason, etc. And for him, I think he used the Arab Orient as a time machine, because one of the things he hated about his European kind of background was the advancement of modernity. He didn't like modernity. He wanted to live in the past. He wanted to live time of King Arthur. He wanted to live, he wanted to, I mean, that was the place he wanted to be. And the war on the Ottoman front actually provided that opportunity for him. So in a way, he imposed his own neo-Arthurian homoerotic development onto that war and conducted it as such. I mean, there's a lot that can be said about him, really. And I mean, one of the things he was described as was like the last archaic classical hero in the modern age, and that was by Rory Stewart when he talks about, him being like a man. But I think the one thing we need to take about it is that really he was a very ambiguous figure, and his attire gave him a lot of that. And also the fact that many people know him more as Lawrence of Arabia than T.E. Lawrence, I think that is something about it. I want now to go into his masquerade. I mean, like I said earlier, so also Burton put on his attire. One of the first times that Burton actually put on his attire was to conduct an espionage mission in Sindh, where he heard that there was some kind of like a brothel where soldiers from the British Army went there to kind of meet other men and boys. So what did he do? He kind of put on his Abdullah attire and went into every corner. So what's interesting about it is that with both Orientalists, whenever they experiment with something homoerotic or sexual or other, it has to be through that kind of mediator, if you like, the kind of the persona. And this is very much what Lawrence is. Well, I mean, one of the things he was involved in for his time in Saudi Arabia was that he was very much interested in, in fact, he was part of the Iranians. These were kind of poets. These were like underground kind of poets who were interested in homoerotic and pederastic things, older men's love for boys. And they wrote alcohol. And he was part of that group. When he went to the region first, he went as an archaeologist. And he met with his donkey boy, his name was Dahon, that we meant like the dark one, real name is Salim. This was in Syria. This is in pre-war kind of Syria. He had a very strange and ambiguous kind of relationship with Dahon. He very much kind of portrayed him as a page with a knife being him. And he was his servant. They went on sort of adventures together. But it was through Dahon that he started dressing up as a local for the first time. So his experience of kind of masquerade does have a touch of the homoerotic. We don't know, I mean, there are some letters which suggest certain things, but we don't know. In fact, the poem in the opening of Seven Pillars to SA is Salim Ahmed, which has been described as one of the most kind of moving love poems ever written. That was dedicated to him, because sadly he died before Lawrence reached Arabia during the First World War in 1918. And one of the other things he did was he dressed up as a woman. You can see there, and went on the first espionage contemplation. This was all before the war. This is before the First World War. This was in Syria. So in a way, it's pre-war time in Syria introduced him to lots of the masquerade stuff, which he took onto another level when we think of him as Lawrence of Arabia, which was made famous by an American publicist named Thomas, who pictured him and then put on a large show in London in 1919 for the presidency, and suddenly he was disappeared. But when the war started, he went to Arabia, he went to Mecca, met Sharif Hussein and Prince Faisal was basically one of the co-leaders of the Arab Revolt, and he was infatuated with it. He really, I mean, I'm gonna go to this quote. So this is a picture of Prince Faisal, who was the son of Sharif Hussein, and he was the third son. And this is what Lawrence had to say about him. I felt at first glance that this was the man I had come to release, the leader who would bring the Arab Revolt. Faisal looked very tall and thin, very slender in his long white silk robes and his brown headdress, bound with a brilliant scarlet and golden wood. His eyelids were cocked, and his black beard and colorless face were like once against Spanish still watch from his body. His hands were crossed in front of him on his dagger. I mean, this is just one of the passages which you could see. I mean, there really is a lot of phallic kind of imagery to it. It's tall, it's slender. But what not many people know is the fact that this brilliant attire was actually Prince Faisal's wedding garments. So this is not what you would wear if you're fighting on Wednesday evening on the Arab. Bedouins did not dress up like that. This was given to him by Prince Faisal, who realized how much he seemed to like him and he liked kind of Arab and Bedouin ways. So his aunt in Mecca sent him those wedding garments, silk robes, all the wedding, etc., as a gesture. It's time he got married. He didn't have time to get married. In a way, he was wedded to him, fighting together. He gave the robe, then he gave the robes to Lawrence. Lawrence was delighted at that opportunity. And there's a scene in Seven Pillars that describes him kind of wearing it for the first time and feeling like a with that. And actually, I mean, speaking of which, is if you look at it like from a Western kind of perspective, I mean, this could be sort of, he looks at it like a medieval kind of king, he looks at it like a kind of biblical figure, also a bit like a bride, you know. I mean, there are lots of, and I think it's that kind of that we don't know that way yet. But then for the Arabs and for the Bedouins, funny enough, this is completely insane. It's just as somebody else's wedding garments and fighting. And unlike the masquerade that Burton had, which was skin deep, it was meant to hide him, and he was a master of disguise. Well, I mean, this makes you more obvious, you know. it didn't really do what it was meant to do. And but then the figure of the blonde Bedouin or the English sheikh became a trope that kind of very much repeated itself in 20th and 21st literature and popular culture. I'm moving now to E.M. Howe. E.M. Howe wrote The Sheikh, and E.M. Howe was a woman who lived in Derbyshire. She was married to a pig farmer who was fighting in the First World War when she wrote this novel. Now, many of you might have come across it as the adaptation, the whole adaptation featuring Valentino, Rudolph Valentino. So this is a black and white film. So The Sheikh, again, is it's seen as like a desert romance. It's a story an aristocratic, again, English woman or Diana Mayor who's bored of European men, that are too civilized, they forgot their natural way, they don't really know how to please women, etc. So she's at this ball at the French embassy in Algiers. She hears a voice from the desert. She follows the voice, and it's she with who kidnaps her, adds her to his family, and tortures her, and does all sorts of things until she falls in love with him, of course. But then miscegenation is avoided because Sheikh Hassan, like Lawrence, he's not really Arab. He's English. He was brought up around the Arabs. That he's a better Arab than the Arabs as well. So we've got this figure of the Sheikh. Now, why is this text significant? It's completely problematic and crazy to hear it from the debate perspective. But this was a woman, and on the very few occasions, but like a woman Orientalist, a woman who's using the Orient as a theme to explore sexuality, that he could explore otherwise. But this then became a bit of a trope because it became such a successful kind of story that then she wrote like the sequel to the Sheikh, then she wrote like the couplet of the Sahara, and then she wrote another one. You know, she got and got like lots of other, so for example, Not My Story Weekly. How there was a lot about that like the Sheikh, this is another story about Ibn Shemi, for example, again, fantasizing about the Sheikh of Damascus, where she was loved by him and all of that. But this also goes onto popular culture and the 20th and the 21st century. So if you're familiar, and what I mean by popular culture as well is advertising, but let's talk about soap operas. Fab, are you familiar with Absolutely Fabulous? Yeah. So Absolutely Fabulous, for those who don't know it, is a British comic comedy. I think it was popular in the 90s. It was aired in the 90s. And it features two women, Patsy and Indina. It's really, lots of it's completely crazy. But this episode in 1994, we've got Patsy and Indina, who suddenly arrive in Morocco. They go to their hotel, and there's a haze of hashish and stuff. And Patsy's sexuality is just awakened the moment she arrives. It's the heat, it's all of that. And she starts kind of flirting like with the young man at the reception, and everything's free, sex, drugs, etc. But at the same time, now they arrive there with their daughter. Daughter's called Saffron, who's like an intellectual. She goes like to research and things. But her mother's quite the opposite. She gets really annoyed with her mother. She goes and takes her to a slave market in Morocco, and she sells her. And this is Safi. So what we've got is this Orient, the image of the Orient, being both a place of sexual awakening, but also a place where, oh, if you're not careful, you could be sexual into slavery, etc. Fast forward to 2012, Sex and the 52 in Abu Dhabi, very problematic, very Orientalist, very racist film, featuring the 4 or 5 women from the famous kind of sitcom in the film, where you've got them as well arriving in Abu Dhabi. It's the heat that awakens their sexuality, but they're not quite happy with the oppression of local women. So there's this very horrible scene where Samantha, the most sexual person of them, starts throwing kind of condoms at men in the streets, you know, and you know, it is again, I see it. This is what you've got. I am a Western woman whose sexuality has been awakened by your feet, but I'm going to help your woman also be awakened. So it is quite problematic. But if we also go into popular culture, so I mentioned advertising earlier. I'm going to show you briefly just a video of a short advert of Fry's Turkish Delight. So Fry's Turkish Delight is a chocolate bar, which you can still get in this country. Apparently, it was quite a lot more kind of popular in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. You can still get it. And it had an advertising campaign, and some of which went on the tube in London. So that they would hire Italian, the Scottish model, who would appear on the tube, so you can see the advert there behind her, and she's there, and she's standing there to advertise Turkish Delight. Now, part of this is this advert, which I Eastern promises. But you see what I mean? It's all and it's that Eastern promise that we're talking about to begin with. If you're thinking of Turkish, well, Turkey doesn't have sand, but it's the Orient. It's the fantasy of the Orient. It's what we want it to be. And I'm going to conclude now. Actually, this is a bit of an afterthought. Okay. Yeah. That one. And this is I came across this during the keynote lecture by Professor who we had at the conference at Sussex a couple of weeks ago. And he pointed out that the picture comes from series of picture. Now I knew the name of the photographer, and he was German, his name is Leonard, and he worked with Landrock, who was his manager. They were both German. They traveled and lived in Tunisia and in Egypt. And Leonard, the photographer, very much specialized in photographing semi-naked boys and girls. Some of them may have been involved in like prostitution and stuff. And it wasn't until then actually, let me just read. There's something that's quite strange and funny in a way about what he writes. So I don't think you can see the quote here, but this is, so basically he photographed them and they sold these as postcards in kind of Europe because it became quite popular, etc. And they were, and I think that, and I got on the bottom of those pictures as like an Arab and his flower. And it says here that about the end of June, each day at sunset, every Arab, rich or poor, buys a small bunch of jasmine from the market, from the vendors. Then, and these flowers are then, this flower is fastened into his turban over the ear, as shown in the pictures. So this was sold to European kind of tourists as something that Arab. Now, fast forward to the 1990s and the early 2000s, an image that's almost certainly based on that appeared on the streets of Tehran and other Iranian cities with the caption Muhammad Rasulullah, meaning Muhammad is the Prophet of God, was being sold as a charm and as like a talisman. I mean, obviously in Shia Islam, it's less frowned upon to depict figures of the but obviously, I mean, this went a long way because this was quite sexualized. And it made me think of the cyclical nature of not just Orientalism, so we talked about tropes of the blonde sheikh, the sheikh, etc., but also tropes of re-Orientalism. This image started there as an Orientalist fantastical depiction of every Arab just puts a flower on his sunset, on his ear of every sunset, into something that was claimed almost as part of Muslim culture in the 1990s and like the early 2000s. And I think until then, the authorities kind of cracked down on the postcard became quite popular as transcendentalism. And this was the afterthoughts, not something I've done more research on, but I found this interesting. Maybe it's something that we can do to later. And that's it. So thank you very much.